Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Nathan J. Robinson, Editor-in-Chief of Current Affairs, author of The Myth of American Idealism, How U.S. Foreign Policy Endangers the World, co-authored with Noam Chomsky. Nathan, welcome to the show. And let me just say, I want to congratulate you not only on the 50th issue of Current Affairs, but also on this book that you've written with Noam Chomsky. It really is fantastic because I'll just say that, I've been reading Noam Chomsky for, I don't know, probably close to 40 years now, which is, I'm old. But to have this in one enterprise, almost like a 101 class on Noam Chomsky is so important. I'm so glad that you did this. Now, this is like a book I'm going to give my daughter, and actually, Howard Zinn's People's History is one of those books, and this one I feel like is very similar in that way. Like, this is a great entry for people.
That's literally what I set out to kind of emulate. Because, Zinn and Chomsky were friends. They were activists together during the Vietnam War era. And Zinn had that great kind of one-volume summation of his critique of mainstream U.S. history. And Chomsky was never that kind of writer who would sit down and put together like a popularization. I mean, as you say, you've been reading Chomsky for decades. The work is brilliant and insightful, but it can be quite dense. And so I'm glad that you say, you feel that it achieved being that kind of one volume summation, because that's what I set out to work with him on producing is, okay, you have this sprawling body of work across literally 100 books. Yeah. How do we boil down what the critical insights are and kind of introduce them to a new generation of readers? And it's also super important. And then I'm going to actually ask you a question, but I remember, and I've cited this many times on this program, interviewing Gore Vidal back in 2004 when we were doing this on radio with Janine Garofalo and I. And he, I think, had just come out with the United States of Amnesia, and I did not understand what he was talking about. Like the idea that we had and now 20 years later, having done this and watching how people have forgotten even stuff that was happening 20 years ago, which to me is in the forefront of my mind, is so important, because this really gives you a sense. And I should say it's mostly or almost entirely post-World War II. But the U.S. foreign policy through that time, this all stuff is when I'm in college, I'm learning, but it does not seem to be part of the calculation and so again, this is great. But let me ask you a question now. What is the myth of American idealism? Well, as Chomsky describes it, and again, I got to be careful here because, this book is my attempt basically to help Chomsky explain his ideas, right? I'm the co-author, but my job is mainly like an organizer of his ideas. But, what he's always said is that there is this range of public debate on U.S. foreign policy in mainstream opinion across the liberal spectrum, from the New York Times, MSNBC, on the right, to the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the National Review, what you hear among people in the Council of Foreign Relations, what have you. And that spectrum, right, runs from America can do no wrong, as George H.W. Bush said, I will never apologize for America. I don't care what the facts are. We literally, by definition, can do no wrong, to what Chomsky calls noble mistake theory. That is to say, we do things that are wrong, but we always do them out of a sense of pure principle idealism. And so the Iraq War was a terrible idealistic mistake. We tried to bring democracy to the people of Iraq, but they just weren't, they couldn't handle democracy. Or Vietnam, we tried to defend democracy in South Vietnam, but we didn't win. It was a tragedy. It was awful. A lot of people died, but we meant well.
well. In Afghanistan, we meant well. And Chomsky's critique has always been that in policy circles, actually, among those who make the decisions, there is very little actual idealism. That the idealism is rhetoric that is for public consumption. But the decisions are actually made with very little regard to, for example, the interests, the welfare of the people of South Vietnam was just not really of interest to Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon. The war, the invasion of Iraq was not an idealistic mission to bring democracy that failed. These are power plays by very powerful men who are in charge of the country. And so Chomsky has always disputed the kind of, yes, he goes after the America can do no wrong theory, but he's also a very, very powerful and trenchant critic of the kind of liberal defense of American power, which is that we do we do things that we mean well, but then they go wrong.
Well, never has this been more evident than in this current moment, right? With Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza, right? And when you compare it, of course, to just more bloodthirsty, but fairly identical kind of outcomes that the right wants, because Brett McGurk across administrations, the Abraham Accords across administrations on this front. But how do you and Chomsky as well square that cynical use of idealism with the fact that a lot of what foreign policy and the execution of foreign policy is in this country is so disconnected from public opinion, particularly at this moment, that there's that chasm there?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the important points in the book is that when we're talking about American idealism, usually we're talking about the powerful. The book is not, Chomsky's often called anti-American or a critic of America. That's a little misleading. We draw a major distinction between the American people, who have always been in public opinion polls, pretty instinctively anti-war. One of the reasons that government has to do a lot of nefarious things in secret is because when the population finds out about them, they're horrified. So yes, and we have a whole chapter on the kind of disconnect between popular opinion and actual public policy. But on what you were saying about Gaza, one of the reasons that Chomsky is so critical of liberal opinion is because he thinks it's almost more dangerous to have people like Joe Biden, who over the course of and I just did an article on foreign policy about the way that the Biden administration faked its negotiations for a ceasefire. Basically, at every stage of the war, they've said, the war is a tragedy. We want it to end. We're trying to negotiate a ceasefire. But they had decided from the outset that they weren't ever going to pressure Israel to agree to a ceasefire. So the negotiations, therefore, couldn't succeed, because in order for them to succeed, you'd have to pressure Israel. But the Biden administration has put up this front of, we really are doing everything. We're working tirelessly every day to try and achieve a ceasefire. Now, on the right, the pro-Israel side, the people like Mike Huckabee are just we don't want a ceasefire. Israel can do what it wants. That's our policy, is for Israel to do whatever it wants. But the Biden administration has this extra layer of deceit, this mask of idealism. And, for Chomsky, that's actually quite dangerous, because it has the power to convince people.
Yeah, I just remember Thomas Friedman's role in the context of Iraq War. And that, in many respects, it's hard to sort of say who is one person determinant, in terms of the tipping point for public support. But Friedman was the guy who otherwise sort of reasonable liberals who would be vaguely anti-war unless it was absolutely necessary. He was the one who sort of brought in that last constituency that, was necessary to be able to, I guess, get a lot of frankly, Democrats and presidential hopefuls at that time to vote to give Bush that authorization. But I want to make one other point too before we go forward. The thing about Chomsky, which I think is misunderstood, unless I think you have listened to a lot of his interviews, because he does address this, but is that this is not campism. The idea is
not that America is uniquely bad, but is typically bad.
Yeah. He says we're no worse than others, but we're no better than others either, right? But we are especially powerful, which is one of the reasons that our actions require attention, and we're also have this very, very powerful mythology about our goodness and our mission in the world, which also makes us kind of especially dangerous. But I actually asked him in an interview. I asked him, about this question of anti-Americanism or singling us out, and he said, he literally said, we're no worse than others, and he started talking about the British Empire and the French in Vietnam and atrocities around the world. In fact, people have accused him of being an apologist for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but he says very clearly, Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, he's a gangster. The invasion of Ukraine was the worst violation of international law since the Iraq War, right? Since our own violation of the law against wars of aggression.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a point that's lost on people, and it's used on some level as a way of discrediting his thesis, and I maybe purposely misunderstanding it in great respect. What accounts is the U.S. unique in its creating this myth about its workings in the world, or is it just unique in the sense that it is so powerful?
It may be unique in some sense in that it's the component of this myth that is about spreading our model to the rest of the world. You don't really see that kind of rhetoric in that expansionist kind of rhetoric.
Democracy versus civilization, right? That might be an updated way. Sorry to cut you off.
No, yeah. You don't see quite that kind of stuff in China, for example. I mean, obviously, you can call China expansionist in its desire to take over Taiwan, but you don't see that kind of, that missionary zeal that we've always had in the United States, the kind of city on a hill stuff, the international inclination. But he points out that these kinds of myths, like war myths, war propaganda, are very common everywhere. And the Russian myths about what they're doing in Ukraine, that they're fighting a war against Nazism, and they're fighting a war to defend their way of life against unprovoked aggression. These are literally the myths that every side in every war uses, right? So, no matter what, and sometimes that doesn't mean there's no right and wrong in war, just because both sides have these mythologies. But every party to a war always sees its own role as defensive. The Japanese in World War II saw themselves as acting defensively. Even Hitler's rhetoric was defensive rhetoric, suggesting that they were under attack. That Germans were under attack in Czechoslovakia, that Jews were attacking German civilization, and so all the rhetoric is always defensive.
Let's talk about the how the U.S. Maintains, or the methodology of it maintaining, or its attempt to maintain hegemony. What you call the, or I guess Chomsky calls the Mafia Doctrine. Explain that to us.
Well, the Mafia Doctrine has what Chomsky talks about is it compares the operations, the thinking of policymakers to the thinking of a kind of mafia godfather. And in case that sounds too cynical, he goes back and draws from, and we recompile in this book, a lot of rhetoric from a lot of language from internal planning documents. There's a wonderful archive that the Office of the State Department historian has, where you can go through and you can see all the memos that are used. And we quote, for example, from a 1950s memo from the Eisenhower administration, where they're talking about whether they should help Britain retain control of Kuwait. And they're talking about how it would affect American interests, entirely about how it would affect American interests. No mention at all as to whether Britain is entitled to retain control of Kuwait or the interests of the people of Kuwait. And so what Chomsky argues, and what I think is proven by a lot of documentation, is that the internal discussions are generally about power. They are generally not about what the public rhetoric is about. So in Vietnam, for instance, the rhetoric is not, the internal discussion is about U.S. credibility and U.S. power, and what would happen to the United States if we were to lose in Vietnam, and not about what would happen to the people of South Vietnam, though obviously the public speeches are all about, well, we're trying to protect the people of South Vietnam from communist aggression. But when things like the Pentagon Papers come out, you find out that that's not what they were talking about. What they were talking about is, what is this going to do to U.S. prestige and U.S. power if a lot of peasants in the jungle are seen to defeat us? And the same with Cuba, where the public rhetoric is about Cuba being a dictatorship, but in private they're talking about, well, what is it going to mean for the United States if a country this close to us, a few miles off the shores of Florida, is able to defy us? And what we need to do is we need to make sure that they are not able to ostentatiously thumb their noses at us. And what Chomsky says is, well, essentially this is completely amoral. This is divorced from, this is the way mafia godfathers think. They think about their own interests, and they're not interested in things like human rights, which are kind of window dressing. And so, yeah, the idea is the policy making itself is generally purely self-interested.
I want to get into what constitutes that self-interest as a nation, but staying on this point for a moment, and it's also about it's usually small and weaker entities that in and of themselves don't create a risk, but set a precedent. I remember interviewing, as an analog, Shannon Moore is an activist up in Alaska. She was a radio host at the time, and they were having a big fight about the Pebble Mine, which is right on the opening of, I think it's Bristol Bay. And she had shown she sat down with the Pebble Mine lawyers and made a great case as to why it just wasn't worth it for them to do this. Mm. And their response was you don't understand. We don't care about this mine. It's just that if we allow the EPA to keep us from getting this mine here, it sets a precedent for every other mine around the country. And so this is not about this fight. This is about some other big fight. And it seems to me I remember Thomas Friedman being interviewed with Charlie Rose. Why did we go to Iraq? And he just said, Charlie, because we could. And that was someone, there was a terrorism bubble, and we had to pop the bubble. But the point was we don't necessarily do these things because they are strategic in a material sense, but they create a perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What Chomsky's always argued is that in some sense the domino theory, which is supposedly discredited, was actually true and did reflect how they thought, which is basic. But it wasn't, that communism would spread. It was that, as Chomsky says, in the case of a godfather, if some small shopkeeper defies him, he sends his goons down around to break his legs, not because he actually needs the protection money from that one shopkeeper, but because, as you say, it sets this kind of precedent. And that kind of language about precedent, in fact, that's quite open. That's not even internal, right? When Nixon's talking about Vietnam, he's talking about U.S. prestige and basically saying we have to win in Vietnam. We have to have the phrase they used was peace with honor, and what peace with honor meant was that if we are seen to lose, that will be bad for us because we will seem like losers, and then it will embolden other people to defy us. So we need to show with extreme violence what happens when you defy the United States, and that is a kind of Godfather-like thinking. It's really disturbing, actually, when you think about the fact that these are human beings, right, that are killed in these wars. That when you see rhetoric like, well, we can't lose we have to support the Shah because if we don't support this horrible, brutal dictator against this popular uprising, our other dictator allies are going to think that we're not going to stand by them. I mean, when you see that kind of rhetoric, it's really, really disturbing.
There was also, and this comes up in the book too. I think it was in for the Iraq War, or maybe it was the first one, where the era of the Vietnam syndrome is over. The celebration of the end of the reluctance of the American public to wage war.
Yeah.
Just talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, no, this is the first Gulf War, which we talk a bit about, really needs to be revisited because it's one of those wars that's seen as one of our like good wars, but it actually wasn't. And this whole thing about
the babies in the incubators.
Yeah, right. All the war propaganda, but also the fact that the war probably could have been averted. And the Bush administration was talking about like how they needed to avoid a diplomatic resolution to the conflict, right? Because Saddam Hussein was like sending out feelers that suggested that he knew he'd made a mistake by invading Kuwait because he didn't understand that the United States would react very badly to it, and was trying to like work out a way to withdraw and kind of save face. And we were like, no. And the Bush administration was essentially trying to avoid that kind of face-saving outcome that would have been a diplomatic resolution, because they saw an opportunity here to show, as George H.W. Bush himself said, that what we say goes. Like, that was the phrase he used. He said, we have to show that what we say goes. And so there was a war that probably could have been avoided through a bit of careful diplomacy. Of course, we don't really know for sure. But yes, you mentioned the Vietnam syndrome. The thought was that the war was great because it had helped overcome that public reluctance to support the use of force that had developed after the catastrophe of Vietnam, and had been one of the reasons why the Reagan administration felt that they couldn't actually wage an outright war in Central America. So the idea was, well, now this is great because we've shown that there can be good wars, and hopefully this syndrome, which is essentially like the public's anti-war, and we kind of had that after the Iraq War too. We have the similar Iraq syndrome, where now like even people like Donald Trump have to kind of posture as anti-war. Well, that really existed after Vietnam, but it was overcome with this great little war we had in the early 90s.
How much do we know about that first Kuwait? Because certainly by within a couple of years, maybe I can't remember exactly when, but there was at least an awareness for people who were interested in this type of thing that. Was it April Glaspie? Was that the name of the our ambassador? She went to talk to, and people forget that we supported Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, to the point where there's photos of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands when Donald Rumsfeld was CEO, I think, of a chemical sort of arms dealer and manufacturer. And we provided chemical weapons for Saddam Hussein that he ultimately used against Kurds up there, but also in his war on Iran. And the idea was like, okay, this is going to help our hegemony as a bulwark against Iran. And when Glaspie went to meet with Hussein, who was like, do you have a problem with my invasion of Kuwait? She's like, we don't get involved in this, which sent basically the signal of like, it's up to you. And then, but do we have a better understanding of what that dynamic is at this point?
Well, so when she went to meet with Hussein, he didn't say he was going to invade Kuwait, but the quote was that the United States have no opinion on Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait. The issue is not associated with America. All that we hope is that these issues are solved quickly, which supposedly Hussein interpreted to mean that the United States would not react if he invaded Kuwait. There's even this quote that I'm not sure how good the sourcing on it is, but allegedly when he was interrogated, he said, after being captured, if you hadn't wanted me to invade, you should have just told me that you didn't want me to invade Kuwait. It's certainly true. I think we know for certain that the United States did not send a strong signal to Saddam Hussein before the invasion of Kuwait that it would object forcefully to this, and that after the invasion of Kuwait, the United States shut down possible diplomatic opportunities, which we kind of recount in the book. And as you mentioned, the record of U.S. support for Saddam Hussein, which we did up until the invasion of Kuwait, was really, really atrocious. I mean, not only did what we did was as Saddam Hussein was committing some of the worst crimes in the history of the 20th century, right, the use of chemical weapons against the Iranian population, we were concealing the evidence and, in fact, helping him, and making sure that the UN didn't find out that he was doing this, and casting doubt on the existing evidence that he was using chemical weapons. Because, as you say, at that point, Saddam was considered to be useful, but then he got too big for his britches and he needed to be taught a lesson. So again, where's the idealism? There's the mask of idealism. The Gulf War is couched in idealistic rhetoric. But Saddam's worst crimes were done during the era of U.S. support, and then there's no accountability for those who supported him. And in fact, the craziest fact to me is that the Bush, we're always told that they didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but that is not strictly true. They found some weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but they didn't publicize it because they were weapons from the era where we've been supporting Saddam, and we didn't want to have to discuss that.
And I mean, and also, and let me just say this, the definition of weapons of mass destruction at that time sort of became very, very expansive. Right. I mean, the amount of like anthrax that you need on a battlefield to kill, even 100 men is just enormous. Like they thought they would find weapons of mass destruction there because we had sold it to them, and they just assumed there was more there. But this stuff was not weapons of mass destruction in the way that we were sold this. There was no mushroom cloud. There was not. You were not going to kill hundreds of thousands of people in New York City.
There was nothing that posed a threat. It was like rusty relics of the 1980s.
100%. And all right, but let's talk about interest, right? Because like there's this couching of U.S. Sort of realpolitik interests, as it were, in this notion of we're spreading democracy or we're helping, spread freedom or whatever it is. But even the concept of what is U.S. interests is sort of is in somewhat veiled as to what we mean by that.
That's right. So you might even say that you think, okay, well, perhaps it's legitimate for states to pursue their own interests. Perhaps they don't need to be idealistic on the international stage. I see through all that. I understand that the world is a bunch of cynical power games. On the other hand, the job of the United States government is, in fact, to look out for American interests. But one of the crucial things that Chomsky does that you point to here is to unpack this term. Well, what are American interests? Well, the thing is that we live in a highly unequal society. I mean, we live in a very class-divided society. And so there isn't one thing called the American interest. There are lots of interests operating within the society, and the interests of some people diverge from the interests of other people. And what's good for fossil fuel companies and what's good for weapons companies is not what's good for the population at large, right? The population at large is not served by the exacerbation of the climate catastrophe. The profits of the fossil fuel industry are, however, served by the exacerbation of climate change. So is the pursuit, if we're pursuing American interests, which of those things is the American interest? Well, what we would argue is that the interests of the society are American interests, but that this term is often used to mask what is in fact a special or particular interest of some powerful or dominant segment of society.
And we should say, it's not just like, when we say like fossil fuel and weapons manufacturers, those may be the most sort of nefarious commodities that are, but it goes back to bananas even. I mean, this is, the idea is that like we're protecting corporate interests,
right,
and making sure that other countries cannot essentially keep their resources to benefit or profit themselves. And, when we've got to deploy military resources to protect someone's ability to corner the banana market in, production in Honduras, 100 some odd years ago, we all end up paying for. This is just like a classic case of socializing the cost and privatizing the profits. We're just doing it with other people's profits.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned fruit, the obvious example being when the United States overthrew the government of Guatemala during the Eisenhower administration after it threatened the profits of the United Fruit Company, and then plunged Guatemala into half a century of horrible civil war and genocide. And then we wonder why there are so many Central American migrants coming to the United States, because we're not told about any of the things that we actually did. The same in Iran, where at the same time, the Iranians moved to nationalize oil production so that they could benefit from their own resources, and we overthrew their government, or worked with elements in Iranian society to overthrow their government, install a horrible military dictatorship, and created the massive anti-American sentiment that persists in Iran to this day and is the source of major global conflict. So one of the important points is that we're not told about any of the things. We're only told about the crimes of others. We're not told about any of the things that we do that cause backlash and response. That was one of Chomsky's main points after the 9/11 attacks. And if we understood these things, we would understand that our interests do, in fact, diverge from what is used rhetorically as the American interest.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.